Brad Hargrove noticed her first on a Tuesday at 2:06 a.m., when the Coronado Beach Resort's medical clinic was supposed to be empty except for the skeleton crew. The night shift nurse moved through the supply room with the kind of quiet that made him uncomfortable, no radio playing, no small talk with the orderlies, no nervous energy. Just efficiency. Methodical. The way she inventoried the 4 stands and restocked the trauma cabinet reminded him of someone checking weapons before deployment, which was absurd because she was just a nurse. Just someone who cleaned up after guests' minor beach accidents and called him when anything serious happened. She had grey blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked like it hurt. Hands that never shook, even when he'd watched her from the doorway during a cardiac episode last month. She'd moved like water then too, not rushing, not panicking. Moving the way people moved when panic was a luxury they'd stopped affording themselves years ago. Her name was Sarah Chen. She'd been hired 8 months ago without much fanfare, and Hargrove had approved her file in under 3 minutes because her credentials checked out and because hiring decisions weren't his specialty and because he had a beverage meeting with the resort's board members that afternoon. What he should have done was pay attention. What he should have done was recognize the warning signs the moment she started asking questions. It began in the supply accounting system. Sarah noticed that elastic bandages were being billed to guest insurance at $72 per unit. The actual wholesale cost from their distributor was $11. Gauze pads, the standard 4x4 medical grade, appeared on guest bills at $40 each. The bulk order from their vendor showed a unit cost of 90 cents. Saline solution, antibiotic ointment, even the hydrogen peroxide bottles in the storage cabinet were being marked up by factors of 6, 7, sometimes 10 times their acquisition price. She didn't say anything for 3 weeks. She simply opened her personal leather notebook during the quiet hours, between midnight and 5 a.m. when the clinic saw maybe 2 patients, both usually minor cuts or stomach issues from bad resort sushi, and she wrote down the figures in neat surgical handwriting. The dates. The exact amounts. The discrepancies between wholesale and billing. Then she started asking. Mr. Hargrove, I noticed something in the supply coding system. Not the time, Sarah. The elastic bandages we billed Mrs. Patterson's insurance last week at $72, the cost sheet from our distributor shows. I said not now. He was in the hallway outside the clinic office, moving fast, wearing the pressed khaki uniform that made him look like he managed a golf course instead of a medical facility. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He simply moved through the corridor faster, as if acceleration was the same as dismissal. Sarah watched him go, her notebook still open in her hands, her voice still caught in her throat where she'd been about to speak. The next morning, she tried again during shift change. Hargrove was meeting with the day shift supervisor near the intake desk. Sarah approached with her notebook, her movement quiet and professional, the way she'd learned to move in rooms where volume was a liability. Sir, if you have 30 seconds, I found what looks like a systematic error in the billing. Sarah. He didn't look up from the clipboard he was reviewing. His voice had that particular quality of dismissal that some managers master, the kind that sounds almost sympathetic while it cuts you off at the knees. I appreciate your attention to detail. But billing reconciliation is handled by corporate accounting. That's not your lane. Your lane is patient care. Let's keep you focused there, yeah. It wasn't a question. She nodded and stepped back. The day shift supervisor, a woman named Margaret who'd worked the clinic for 6 years, avoided her eyes. Hargrove began avoiding her after that. Not obviously. Subtly. He would arrive at the clinic at times he used to never visit, 8 a.m. when the day shift was fully staffed, never during the quiet hours when Sarah worked alone. When she was restocking supplies and he needed to enter the storage room, he would wait outside the door until she left. When she tried to attend the mandatory staff meeting on Friday afternoons, she found the schedule changed. Night shift personnel will receive briefing notes via email. No meeting attendant required. His signature was on the memo. She was the only night shift employee. In the break room, something shifted. Margaret had always nodded hello. The orderlies, Danny and Keith, had always asked how her night was going. Now when Sarah opened the door with her coffee mug, their voices would taper off. Margaret would finish her meal and leave. Keith would suddenly remember he needed something from his locker. Danny would check his phone with extreme interest, his shoulders tensing. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody had to. The silence was its own language. The silence meant you noticed something you weren't supposed to notice. The silence meant you asked questions in front of the wrong person. The silence meant you're alone now. Sarah had been trained to recognize hostile environments. She had lived in hostile environments. She had operated in places where the air itself felt like it wanted to kill you, where trust was a luxury that got people killed, where reading the room was the difference between another sunrise and a body bag. So she recognized this for what it was: calculated social isolation. Hargrove was a man who understood that humiliation worked best when it was quiet. When nobody had to raise their voice. When the victim was left to wonder if they'd imagined the coldness or if it was real. When they couldn't quite prove that anyone was being unkind. But Sarah didn't wonder. She knew exactly what was happening. She simply kept working. Her hands moved with the same precision they always had, stocking the wound care cart, checking the defibrillator pads for expiration dates, verifying the medication cabinet locks. She maintained her composure the way she'd maintained it through 2 deployments and a classified extraction in Tikrit that had left 3 operators bleeding out on a compound floor and her face on a kill list that probably still existed somewhere in a Pentagon database. The way she'd maintained it through 15 years of living as someone else, using a name that wasn't hers, in a life that belonged to a ghost. Hargrove's cold shoulder was a scheduling inconvenience compared to what she'd survived. His subtle cruelty was a light rain compared to the storms she'd already walked through. She took it. She accepted the isolation. She showed up for her shifts at 10 p.m. and left at 6 a.m. with the same quiet efficiency, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply doing the work that needed doing because that was what professionals did. They didn't cry in supply closets. They didn't let their voices shake. They didn't give small men like Brad Hargrove the satisfaction of knowing they'd drawn blood. Inside her locker, hanging on the hook behind her extra scrubs, was a jacket. Dark blue. Cotton blend. The kind of jacket you picked up at a thrift store in suburban San Diego where nobody asked questions about your name or your history or the call signs that were embroidered on the sleeves in faded gold thread. Reaper. That was what they'd called her. That was what the call sign said before she'd buried it 15 years ago. Sewn into the interior jacket lining, behind the care instructions label, was a small patch. Faded green. The symbol of the 5th Special Forces Group. The unit she'd been attached to before the Navy ordered her to disappear. Before her records were expunged. Before the government decided that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had to stop existing because a hostage extraction in Tikrit had gone sideways and there were people in power who preferred their Black Ops failures stayed buried. She touched the patch sometimes, during her breaks. Just her fingertips against the fabric. Just a reminder that she had been something else once. That she'd been someone who mattered. That underneath the quiet night nurse who didn't ask questions and didn't push back and didn't make a fuss, there was still a soldier. Still someone who understood that true strength wasn't measured in decibels. True strength was the kind that smiled at the person trying to break you and went back to work anyway. The radio crackled at 7:04 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in early October. Medical clinic, we have an emergency at North Beach. Unknown male, approximately 60 years old, unresponsive in the water. Fire rescue is extracting now, ETA 8 minutes. Sarah was already moving. Her hands were pulling the trauma cart toward the treatment room before her brain had finished processing the message. Oxygen tank. Defibrillator. Suction. She was arranging everything with a kind of speed that came from muscle memory, from having done this in conditions far worse than a quiet beachside clinic, from having seen what happens when you waste even 5 seconds in a medical crisis. Copy, she said into the radio. Treatment room 1 standing by. She was just checking the intubation kit when the doors burst open and fire rescue brought him in on a stretcher, a man with wet hair and water streaming from his clothes and a wife behind him screaming his name. Colonel Marcus Webb. That was what the wife kept saying. Marcus, Marcus, stay with me. 63 years old according to the medical alert bracelet. Unresponsive. No pulse they could find. No obvious signs of breathing. Sarah's eyes locked onto the wife's for just a moment. She saw the terror there. She saw the kind of fear that doesn't have words. She'd seen that fear before, on faces of soldiers who knew they were dying, on the faces of civilians in extraction zones, on the face of her own son the day he told her he'd been accepted to officer candidate school. "We're going to help him," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet. It was steady. It was the voice of someone who had held people's lives together with nothing but hands and training and the absolute refusal to fail. "I've got him." The sand was warm under her feet. Cold water soaked through her scrubs. Sarah didn't pause, didn't think about it. The man lay face down in the shallows, his wife screaming his name behind her, and Sarah was already kneeling, rolling him onto his back with the careful precision of someone who had moved broken bodies before. Colonel Marcus Webb. His wife had screamed it twice. "Commanding officer. Leave. San Diego." His lips were blue. Sarah tilted his head back, cleared his airway with a finger sweep. Sand, salt water, nothing blocking the throat. She placed her mouth over his and breathed. Once. Twice. His chest rose. Good. She pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery. Pulse. Weak, thready, but present. The oxygen saturation in his blood was dropping like a stone down a well, but his heart was still working. "Stay back," Sarah said to Rebecca Webb, whose voice had become a high keening sound. "I've got him." Rebecca's hands hovered over her husband's face. She didn't move back. She couldn't. Sarah's hands moved through the assessment without hesitation. Palpated his spine, C-spine intact, no obvious fracture. Riptide didn't usually mean spinal injury, but water accidents were violent things and assumptions killed people. She checked his pupils. Blown. Both of them. The pressure inside his skull was climbing. Drowning had filled his lungs with seawater and his brain with fluid. The clock was already running. "What's his name?" Sarah kept her voice level, the way you speak to someone whose world is ending. "Marcus. Marcus Webb." "He's breathing, right?" "Tell me his." "He's breathing," Sarah said. It was true and it was false. His body was breathing because she was doing it for him. His lungs weren't exchanging oxygen. His brain wasn't getting what it needed. But she didn't say that. She said, "We need to get him to a clinic. Now." She pulled out her radio, the one Hargrove said she wasn't authorized to use, and called resort security. Her voice didn't shake. "Medical emergency, beachside near the North Pavilion. Unresponsive male, suspected in a drowning. Need ambulance and spine board." Etta. Static crackled back. 3 minutes. "We're calling 911 now." 3 minutes. The drive from the medical clinic to here was 2 minutes. The ambulance was coming from 3 miles away. So it was really 5 minutes before professional equipment arrived, before they had a stretcher and oxygen and the tools that actually worked. She had 5 minutes to keep his brain alive on borrowed oxygen and her steady hands. Sarah positioned him in the recovery position, angling his body so any remaining water in his lungs would drain. She watched his face. Cyanosis wasn't fading. If anything, the blue was deepening around his lips like watercolor bleeding into white paper. "How long?" Rebecca asked. "How long was he in the water?" "I don't know. I didn't see." Sarah calculated. The riptide that took him had pulled him out maybe 50 yards. If he'd struggled, if panic had made him thrash, he could have been under for 2-3 minutes before she spotted him. Brain death starts at 4 minutes. Permanent neurological damage at 6. He was already on borrowed time. She checked his pupils again. Still blown. The pressure in his skull was mounting like a storm system building offshore, and there was nothing she could do about it except keep oxygen moving and pray the ambulance didn't take 10 minutes. It took 8. The EMT crew had the spine board and the oxygen and the protocols. Sarah stepped back as they worked, giving her report in the crisp shorthand of someone who had done this 100 times before. Unresponsive, found in water, riptide incident, probable aspiration, approximate submersion time unknown, pupils fixed and dilated, ongoing positive pressure ventilation initiated at scene. "You're the nurse," one of them asked, strapping the oxygen mask over Webb's face. "Night shift at the resort clinic. You kept him stable." She didn't answer because answering wasn't necessary. The numbers were speaking. His oxygen saturation was climbing, not fast enough, not enough, but climbing. His heart rate was 84. His skin was still slate gray, but the deeper blue was fading from his lips. If they got him to a real hospital in the next 10 minutes, maybe, possibly, he had a chance. The ambulance pulled away with lights and sirens cutting the afternoon in half. Rebecca Webb stood on the sand, soaking wet, shaking. Sarah turned to her and took her hand. "He's alive," Sarah said. "You saw me get him breathing. His heart's beating. We got him to the ambulance. That's everything we could do here." "Thank you," Rebecca whispered. "Thank you. David is going to." Marcus is David's commanding officer. "He's here on leave. He was just swimming because he said the ocean back home in North Carolina wasn't warm enough and—" "He's going to be okay," Sarah said, and she meant it like a vow, and she had no way of knowing if it was true. The next day, Sarah was back at the clinic, restocking the examination room supply cabinet and filling out incident reports in the sterile quiet of the place where nobody spoke to her anymore. The door burst open. She didn't turn around. "You," Hargrove said. His voice had the quality of a tank idling in a garage, heavy, dangerous, barely contained. "You used $240 of resort supplies without authorization. Oxygen, saline, trauma shears, the spine board we lease for $3,000 a month, you used it in the sand. For what?" "A training exercise." Sarah turned to face him. "For a drowning man. You are a nurse. You are employed to provide basic first aid within this clinic. You are not employed to commandeer resort equipment and play doctor on our private beach. This isn't a hospital. You're not a doctor. And you certainly don't have authority to spend my supplies." He said my supplies like a man who believed ownership meant righteousness. Sarah's hands were still damp from washing sand away. She placed them flat on the counter and felt the muscle memory of 1,000 mornings getting ready for something harder than this. "The man would have died if I hadn't been on that beach. That's not your judgment to make. His wife is a guest. He's military. And someone," she said quietly, "had to keep him alive until the ambulance came." Hargrove's face was reddening in blotches, the way faces did when power was slipping away in front of witnesses. There were no witnesses here, just the two of them in the white-walled clinic that smelled like antiseptic and failure. But he couldn't fire her, not yet, not without it looking like retaliation for saving a man's life. So instead he said, "You're on the overnight shift. Effective immediately. Alone. No backup. And you're going to pay back those supplies from your paychecks, or I will pursue this through legal channels." He turned to leave. Sarah's voice was still level. "You should check what you're really billing for those bandages before you accuse me of theft." He stopped. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Then he walked out, and the door swung shut, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects in a jar. The next afternoon, Sarah sat in the break room with a cup of black coffee. The room had never felt smaller. Ashley, the receptionist, was sitting at the far corner of the table with her phone. When Sarah sat down, Ashley looked up, made a face like she'd tasted something rotten, and stood. The lifeguard coordinator followed. Then the activities director. One by one, they found reasons to leave. Sarah sat alone at the table and drank her coffee. The cup was chipped at the rim. The coffee was lukewarm. The fluorescent light above her head flickered in a rhythm that would drive most people insane if they thought about it long enough. She didn't think about it. She thought about Colonel Webb lying on that stretcher, his wife's hand gripping hers, the ambulance siren fading down the coastal highway. 2 days later, a piece of paper appeared on the employee board next to the shift schedule. Written warning. Chen. Unauthorized medical interventions. Inventory discrepancies under investigation. Failure to follow chain of command protocols. Hargrove had written her name in full capital letters. Everyone who checked their shift would see it. Everyone who clocked in would read it. A permanent announcement that she was a problem. The morning staff read it as they filtered through the hallway. Sarah watched their eyes move from the notice to her, then away. No one looked directly at her. No one asked what had happened or why. They just knew that she was someone to avoid. Hargrove walked past her in the hallway, deliberately loud. Florence Nightingale's learning that heroes don't last long when they can't follow simple rules. The words landed like stones in still water. Sarah reached up and touched the disciplinary notice. Her finger traced the letters of her name. A single tear escaped, just one, precise as a drop of medicine from a syringe. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the paper, then turned to Hargrove. Her voice came out level, controlled, each word a separate instrument. You should check what you're really billing for those bandages before you accuse me of theft. The color drained from his face. For just a moment, she saw uncertainty flicker across his features, the look of a man realizing that the person he'd been bullying might know something dangerous. Then he recovered, straightened his shoulders, and walked away. That night, at 11 p.m., her personal cell phone rang. Rebecca Webb's voice came through tight and terrified. Sarah? It's Rebecca. Marcus is at the hotel. He collapsed. He can't breathe. He's turning blue and I don't know what's wrong and you saved him once already and I'm scared he's dying. Sarah grabbed her medical bag without hesitation. She was already moving, already running, already in the zone where fear became data and doubt became irrelevant. But that wasn't the worst part. The phone rang at 11:24 p.m. Sarah was restocking the clinic's back supply cabinet when Rebecca Webb's voice cut through the line, high, fractured, barely controlled. He can't breathe. He's making this sound, this awful whistling sound, and his chest isn't moving right. We're at the Palomar Suite. Please. Please come now. Sarah didn't ask questions. She didn't call for backup. She was already moving, jacket off the hook, medical bag in her hand, muscle memory taking over from a part of her that never really slept. The night shift had 14 minutes until change of staff. The distance from the clinic to the Webb's hotel suite was exactly 470 meters across the resort grounds. She knew because she'd walked it 100 times on her solitary breaks, measuring distances the way old soldiers always do. The darkness was thick. October air off the Pacific carried salt and kelp, the smell hitting her sinuses as she sprinted across the grounds, her footsteps muffled on the sand-edged pavement. No radio. No backup request. No protocol. Just the weight of her bag and the sound of her breathing, controlled, even, the same rhythm she'd learned to maintain in the dark compounds of Tikrit 15 years ago. The Webmar suite door was open before she reached it. Rebecca stood in the threshold, her silk robe wrapped tight, her face the color of old bone. He's on the floor. He was sitting on the balcony, and then he just couldn't breathe. Colonel Marcus Webb lay on the hotel room tile, his back against the bed frame, his breathing a desperate high-pitched wheeze that came in short, ineffective gasps. His skin had taken on a bluish cast around the lips. Sarah dropped to her knees, her hands already moving, already assessing. She'd seen this before. Different countries. Different decades. Same deadly physics. When did the riptide pull him out? Sarah's voice was perfectly level. 2 days ago. The doctor said he was fine. They cleared him. They said. Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Her fingers found the place where his chest should rise and fall, found instead the terrifying absence of air movement on the right side. The trachea deviated slightly left. The jugular veins distended like cords. She pressed her stethoscope to his ribs and heard nothing, no breath sounds, no air entry, just the faint whoosh of his heart working overtime to compensate for a body starving for oxygen. Delayed barotrauma. The pressure change from the riptide had ruptured a small air sac in his lung. 2 days of internal bleeding and air accumulation in the pleural space. His lung didn't just collapse, it was compressing his heart. Rebecca, I need you to call 911. Tell them code blue at the Palomar suite. Tell them we have a tension pneumothorax in progress. Do it now. Rebecca moved. Sarah opened her medical bag with the precision of someone who'd done this in sandstorms and blood-soaked tents. She found the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the same setup she'd used on a Delta operator named Crawford in a compound outside Mosul. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into her muscle memory like a map she'd memorized in her sleep. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. That holy sound that meant pressure was releasing, meant his heart could beat again without being crushed by his own lung turning against him. Come on, Colonel. Her voice was almost a whisper. Stay with me. The wheeze changed. His breathing shifted from the desperate high note to something deeper, something that carried actual air. His O2 sat had been impossible to measure before, the device wouldn't register below 70. Now it climbed. 71, 75. 79. The clinic door burst open with enough force that it hit the wall. Brad Hargrove stood in the doorway, his face already red, his voice a roar that seemed to shake the Palomar suite's $10,000 Italian tile. What in the hell are you doing? You're fired. You were terminated. You cannot be here. You cannot touch him. Sarah didn't look up. Her hands were steady. Her breathing remained even. She was checking his breath sounds again, the left side now clear, the pneumothorax partially decompressed. Hargrove moved toward her, his body blocking the doorway, his arm raising as if to physically push her away from the patient. Step back, doctor, Sarah said. The tone hadn't changed. The voice was still level. But something in those 3 words, the way they landed, the weight they carried, made Hargrove pause for exactly 1 second. 1 second was all she needed. She reached for the oxygen mask, reached for the nasal cannula setup, and Hargrove lunged. You don't have authorization. You don't have credentials. You're practicing medicine without a license. His carotid pulse is thready. His O2 is climbing, but his chest cavity still has pneumothorax pockets. Sarah's voice cut through his like a knife through silk. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't explaining. She was stating facts the way a commander states objectives. I need a second 14-gauge needle. The kit is in the clinic. Move. No. Absolutely not. Security is coming. You will not. Rebecca Webb's voice came from somewhere near the balcony. She was on the phone, and her voice was shaking. He's a colonel. Colonel Marcus Webb. My husband is a Green Beret, and this nurse is saving his life. You can either help or get out of the way. Hargrove's face deepened to something past red. His jaw moved, but no words came. Sarah didn't wait for them. She was already moving past him, already to the clinic door, her hands already reaching for the second needle, the secondary decompression setup. Hargrove followed her, his voice a continuous stream of threats that bounced off the tile and meant nothing. You're finished. I'm calling the board right now. I'm calling everyone. Your credentials are done. Your career is finished. Do you understand me? Finished. Sarah pressed the second needle into the 4th intercostal space. The hiss again. Colonel Webb's breathing deepened further. His O2 sat climbed to 87. The color began to return to his lips. She didn't respond to Hargrove's threats. She didn't acknowledge him at all. She simply worked with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen and having survived it alone. Hargrove left. Sarah heard his footsteps, hard and fast, moving away from the suite toward the clinic. She didn't think about what he was doing. She didn't think about the look on Rebecca Webb's face or the way Colonel Webb's hand had gripped her wrist as oxygen finally, reached his brain again. She thought about nothing but the next breath, the next vital sign, the next moment where a man lived instead of died. The ambulance came at 12:09 a.m. The paramedics found Colonel Webb stabilized, his O2 at 91%, his blood pressure climbing back to something survivable, and a nurse in a plain scrub top who stepped back without speaking and let them take over. They didn't ask her name. They didn't ask how long she'd been performing emergency procedures that required a medical degree she officially didn't have. They just worked around her like she was part of the infrastructure, part of the building itself. But Hargrove was already in his office. Sarah didn't know this yet. She was riding in the ambulance with Colonel Webb, her medical bag on the seat beside her, her phone dark in her pocket. But at 12:14 a.m., Hargrove called Gerald Paulson, the board member who owed him favors. "We have a liability catastrophe," he said. "A rogue medical staff member without proper credentials just performed emergency procedures on a high-profile patient. We need immediate termination and damage control before this becomes a lawsuit." At 12:43 a.m., he called the VA hospital in Los Angeles. The nursing supervisor who answered had never heard of Sarah Chen. No employment records. No reference file. Nothing. At 1:17 a.m., he hired a private investigator named Don Rourke, gave him Sarah's name and description, and told him to find discrepancies. And what he didn't know, what he would never know until it was far too late, was that the woman he was dismantling in the darkness wasn't a nurse who'd taken a new identity. She was a ghost who'd been given one. A senior chief petty officer who'd been ordered to disappear because a hostage extraction in Tikrit had gone sideways in 2009, because the Navy had scrubbed her records, because she'd been marked for erasure and told never to surface again. He'd just declared war on someone who'd already been to war. Hargrove moved through the afternoon like a man who'd finally found his lever. He sat in the resort's corner office at 3:47 p.m., the late sun cutting through the windows in brutal slats of gold, and made his first call. Gerald Paulson answered on the second ring, Paulson who'd benefited from Hargrove's discretion regarding a certain incident with a hotel guest and a missing piece of jewelry that never made it into any report. Hargrove's voice was smooth, rehearsed. "Gerald, we have a situation. An unlicensed medical practitioner operating inside our facility. She's been performing procedures, using supplies, billing directly to insurance companies." He let that settle. "She assaulted Colonel Webb, performed unauthorized interventions while I was present. The family's talking about a lawsuit. We need documentation that we shut this down immediately." Paulson promised action before the call ended. The second call went to the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Los Angeles where Sarah's employment references supposedly originated. Hargrove identified himself as a resort administrator conducting a routine background check, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The HR representative there pulled records on a nurse named Sarah Chen. Nothing. No employment history. No record of hire or termination. No forwarding references. The representative apologized for the inconvenience. Hargrove thanked her, his pulse quickening. She didn't exist. By 5:15 p.m., a private investigator named David Kemp sat in Hargrove's office with a laptop open, and beside him, the resort's corporate HR director, Patricia Vasquez, a woman with the flat expression of someone prepared for litigation. Kemp's tie was loosened, his eyes had the exhausted competence of a man who'd spent 15 years digging through lies. "No prior employment records," he said, scrolling through his findings. "No nursing licensure under Sarah Chen in California, Nevada, or Arizona. No social security history before 2009. Credit report shows the identity was established with documents dated that year. This is a constructed identity, Mr. Hargrove. Vasquez leaned forward, her pen poised. She fabricated her credentials. She's been operating as a medical professional with no legitimate licensing. If she treated patients without authorization, we're looking at fraud, unlicensed medical practice, potential endangerment. She made a note. We secure her immediately. Security escorted Sarah from the premises at 6:23 p.m. 2 guards in charcoal uniforms flanked her as she walked from the staff corridor to the employee parking area. Her keycard had been deactivated 17 minutes earlier. Her locker had been emptied into a cardboard box, not carefully, not respectfully. Her personal items spilled across the bottom like the contents of a grave, a coffee mug that read "A nurses give care from the heart," a framed photograph of David in his dress uniform from his commissioning ceremony, her spare stethoscope, her lunch container from that morning, still containing the half-eaten sandwich she'd never gotten to eat. The box felt impossibly heavy. One of the guards offered to carry it. She declined. Her hands, the ones that had been steady while saving a man's life, carried that box across the parking lot in absolute silence. She sat at her kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon the next day, the cardboard box beside her on the linoleum floor like a silent accusation. The house was quiet in a way that felt wrong, the kind of quiet that happens in vacant buildings, the kind that accumulates dust. Rain hammered the kitchen window in rhythmic bursts, and she stared at nothing, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. The termination letter lay on the table in front of her. She'd read it 12 times. Practicing medicine without valid credentials. Fraudulent employment history. Pending investigation for medical fraud. Unauthorized medical interventions. Inventory discrepancies. The letterhead of Coronado Beach Resort's legal department stamped across the top like a judgment. A single tear moved down her cheek without warning or permission. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. That's when David's truck pulled into the driveway. She heard the engine cut off, heard the driver's side door open and close, and she straightened in her chair with the desperate speed of someone trying to compose themselves before impact. Her son appeared in the kitchen doorway still wearing his camouflage utilities, the uniform of a Marine Lance Corporal stationed at Camp Pendleton, 15 minutes north of San Diego. His hair was cut to regulation. His boots were polished to a shine that reflected light. He was supposed to be at the base for another 6 hours. His eyes found the cardboard box first, then moved to her face, and something in his expression shifted from the normal daily casualness of a 23-year-old who still sometimes forgot to text his mother back into something sharper, something alert. His voice came out small, uncertain, the voice of a boy even though he was a Marine and carried a rifle and had stood watch in the desert. "Mom, why are you home early?" Sarah looked at her son across the kitchen table, at the concern carving itself into the corners of his eyes, and found that no words would form. She tried. Her mouth opened. Nothing came. The coffee mug sat cold in her hands like a prayer that had already been answered with silence. David took 3 steps forward, his eyes scanning the table, and then he saw the letter. His fingers reached for it before his brain caught up, and he read the first line, then the second, then the entire page while his jaw tightened like a fist, the muscle working beneath his skin in slow, deliberate movements. "Mom, what is this?" His voice had changed. That was the thing that broke her, that he was asking the question as a Marine now, as someone trained to read situations for threat. "Why don't your references check out?" She closed her eyes. She could lie. She could tell him it was a misunderstanding, an error in paperwork, something bureaucratic and recoverable. She could protect him from the truth the way she'd been protecting him for 15 years. She could keep the story of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen buried in Tikrit where the Navy had ordered it to stay. Instead, she opened her eyes and looked at her son across that kitchen table in San Diego on an afternoon when the rain sounded like artillery, and she said it. Because Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen doesn't exist anymore. She died in Tikrit in 2009 when the Navy scrubbed her records and told her to disappear. David went still. The letter hung from his fingertips like evidence at a crime scene. She told him everything then, the words coming in fragments that somehow, miraculously, formed a narrative. The classified hostage extraction that went sideways. The SEAL team for unit she was embedded with as a combat medic. The 3 wounded operators taking fire in a Tikrit compound on a night in May when the world contracted to the size of a stairwell and the sound of rounds punching through walls and the weight of a man's arm across her shoulders as she dragged him toward the exit. The Green Beret liaison unit providing suppressing fire from the rooftops while she worked, moving between operators with a speed that muscle memory had encoded into her nervous system. The shrapnel that tore through her arm and kept going. The orders that came afterward, not a promotion, not a medal, but an erasure. The Navy's solution to a classified operation that couldn't be acknowledged: scatter the unit, scrub the records, create a new identity, tell her never to surface. She stood and walked to her bedroom, and when she returned, she held her old jacket. The one she never wore anymore, the one she kept in the back of her closet folded beneath her winter coats. She turned the jacket inside out and showed him the faded Green Beret unit patch sewn into the lining with stitches that had held through 15 years of silence. The patch was worn, the edges soft from years of her fingers touching it in the dark, verifying that it was still there, that she had been real, that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had existed and done what the records said never happened. David stared at the patch like he was trying to memorize it. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice carried the parade ground precision of a Marine officer giving an order. Colonel Webb needs to know who saved him. That night, Rebecca Webb called at 8:41 p.m. Her voice carried the gratitude of a woman whose husband had been given back to her, the urgency of a woman with a secret that demanded to be shared. "Sarah, he's awake. He's asking for you. Please, just for a minute." "He won't stop asking." Sarah heard the plea beneath the words, Marcus Webb remembering something through the fog of unconsciousness, remembering hands moving with a precision that transcended civilian medicine, remembering a presence that had brought him back from the threshold of death and then done it again. She drove to Mercy General in San Diego in her civilian clothes, through rain that drummed against the windshield like urgent fingers. The ICU floor was quiet at 9:34 p.m., the kind of quiet that happens in hospitals at night when most of the world is sleeping and the ones still awake are fighting battles that the daylight won't understand. She stood in the doorway of Colonel Webb's room in her jeans and her jacket, no badge, no authority, just a woman who'd learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can carry is your real name. Webb's eyes opened when she entered. They moved across the room until they found her face, and something happened in those eyes, recognition, not of a name but of a presence, of a specific frequency of competence that you only encounter a few times in your life if you're lucky enough to live that long. His oxygen mask fogged with each breath. His lips moved beneath it. The words came out as a whisper that barely cleared the distance between them, but Sarah heard every syllable with the clarity of someone who'd trained to hear danger in the smallest sounds. "Reaper." David stood in the hospital corridor in his marine dress blues, his jaw tight as Colonel Webb spoke the single word that changed everything. Sarah's hands trembled, not with fear but with the weight of 15 years collapsing into a single moment. The machines around Webb's bed beeped in steady rhythm, indifferent to the identity unraveling in room for 12 at Mercy General. David stepped forward, his voice steady and formal. "Colonel, you're addressing Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy." The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Brennan, looked up from the monitors where Webb's oxygen saturation had climbed to 94%, stable now, breathing on his own. His hands went very still. He excused himself and returned for minutes later with a sealed folder bearing a red classified stamp, the kind that doesn't appear in civilian hospitals often, if ever. Brennan's hands trembled as he read. His face went the color of old bone. When he looked at Sarah, his entire posture shifted, the subtle physics of respect and recognition. "I need to make a phone call," he said, not to anyone in particular, more to himself, like a man confirming he was still conscious. Sarah remained perfectly still. She had learned, over 15 years of invisibility, how to occupy space without disturbing the air around her. The breathing tube was gone. Webb was moving his eyes, tracking sound, cognition returning like a diver surfacing from deep water. Rebecca sat in the corner chair, her hand over her mouth, watching the woman she'd invited for coffee 6 days ago, the quiet nurse who'd known exactly where to push the needle when her husband stopped breathing. The phone call took 17 minutes. In that time, Brennan read aloud, his voice climbing slightly as each sentence registered. 2 tours as a Special Operations medic, embedded with SEAL Team 6 and the 75th Ranger Regiment. 17 combat operations. 23 personnel extracted from hot zones under her direct medical intervention. Bronze Star. The words hung in the room like shells after the firing stops. Another Bronze Star. A third. The physician's voice wavered on that one. Then, Purple Heart, 2 counts, wound sustained during a classified hostage extraction at a compound in Tikrit in 2009, where she had entered a kill zone to retrieve 3 operators with combined blood loss exceeding critical levels. She had performed emergency tourniquet application under sustained small arms fire. She had walked out carrying a wounded operator who weighed 218 pounds while rounds impacted the walls around her. David's eyes were wet. He didn't look away from his mother. The next voice through the phone was a woman's, Special Agent Lisa Vickers, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counterintelligence Division, currently stationed at the San Diego field office. She asked Brennan 3 questions, listened to his answers, and said, "Keep that file sealed. We'll be at Coronado Beach Resort within 2 hours. She needs to stay there." Hargrove was in his office on the ground floor of the Coronado Beach Resort when security called up at 2:38 p.m. 3 federal agents in the lobby. "They're asking for him." His face, which had been smugly reviewing termination paperwork, pen poised over Sarah's exit severance which he'd written at exactly 37 cents on the dollar, went white. Not pale. White, like someone had switched off the blood supply behind his eyes. The pen clattered to the desk. He smoothed his tie. He checked his reflection in the darkened window. He walked downstairs as if ascending to his own execution, because, in a way, he was. Special Agent Vickers was a woman who looked like she could negotiate with Stone and win territorial concessions. Her deputies flanked the conference room entrance. Hargrove's lawyer, Richard Sterling, was already seated. How had Sterling gotten here so fast, which meant Hargrove understood, at some animal level, that this was no longer a conversation. This was a tribunal. Vickers opened a folder. Then another. Then a third, which she slid across the table with the precision of a dealer laying down cards that would break him. The IT technician, Tommy Nguyen, was a Marine Corps veteran who'd worked the resort security systems for 4 years. Hargrove had never spoken to him beyond a curt nod. Tommy had, however, been very interested in why the director was attempting to delete security footage from the night Sarah Chen had performed a needle decompression on a man who wasn't breathing. Tommy had noticed the deletion attempt at 1:23 a.m. Tommy had been meticulous. Tommy had backed up every frame to 3 separate encrypted drives before reporting it to the FBI. Vickers pressed play on a tablet. The footage was pristine. For angles. Hargrove screaming that Sarah was fired while Colonel Webb's oxygen saturation dropped. Sarah's hands moving with the steady precision of muscle memory forged in blood and sand. The needle sliding into the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the hiss of air escaping the collapsed lung, the sound that meant he would breathe. Hargrove grabbing Sarah's wrist. Sarah not flinching. Webb's oxygen climbing, 75, 82, 88, stable. Hargrove's face in the footage showed pure rage that she was saving a life without his permission. "Let's talk about the billing," Vickers said. The records were immaculate. $40 gauze pads billed at $440. $200 first aid kits marked up to $2,000. Antibacterial ointment marked at 16 times cost. Compression bandages listed as orthopedic specialist consultations. 3 years of systematic inflation, totaling $372,000 in fraudulent charges. Insurance companies had paid. Guests on their policies had seen increases. The scheme had been quiet. It had been profitable. It had worked until Sarah Chen asked one question about why bandages cost what they did. Hargrove's lawyer leaned over and whispered something. Hargrove nodded, the gesture of a man drowning. "I want to cooperate," he said, his voice thin as paper. "You're under federal investigation for wire fraud, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice," Vickers said. "Your medical coordinator license is suspended pending a hearing. You're not cooperating. You're turning yourself in." He was read his rights in the same conference room where he'd humiliated Sarah in front of the board 3 days earlier. The same room where he'd told her that protocols existed for reasons. That she was overstepping. That unauthorized interventions were crimes against procedure. The cuffs went on at 3:14 p.m. Security escorted him from the building at 3:18 p.m. His face was recorded on the exit camera. The footage would be saved, backed up, distributed through federal channels. The Coronado Beach Resort terminated his employment 3 minutes later and notified the state medical board that they would not be contesting the license revocation. By evening, the story had reached the San Diego Union Tribune. By midnight, it had spread through every Navy family within 200 miles. Brad Hargrove, bullied a medic, attempted to destroy her, didn't know she was a legend. The internet did what the internet does. His LinkedIn was flooded. His personal address, which was remarkably easy to find, was posted in 4 different places. He'd made the mistake of trying to destroy someone invisible, someone protected by the kind of loyalty that doesn't break under pressure because it's built from shared blood and shared fire. The attending physician at Mercy General made calls too. By 6 p.m., Colonel Webb's commanding officer, Major Thomas Hendricks, was on a flight from Fort Bragg to San Diego. By 8 p.m., Lieutenant Commander James Kessler, who'd been beside Webb during that ticket extraction, was calling every member of the Green Beret unit still stationed in the continental United States. By 10 p.m., 100 soldiers had committed to transportation. By midnight, they were en route. Sarah sat in her home, in the quiet house where she'd raised David as a single mother, where she'd worked 2 jobs to keep him fed, where she'd never once explained why she woke screaming from dreams she couldn't name. David sat beside her on the couch. Neither spoke. The television was off. The lights were low. Outside, the Pacific Ocean moved through its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the woman who'd spent 15 years pretending to be ordinary while extraordinary slept in the cell next to her heart. "They're coming," David said finally. "They're all coming." Sarah didn't respond. She was touching the faded unit patch, still sewn into her jacket lining, still carrying the weight of soldiers who hadn't forgotten what it meant to vanish so that others could survive. She was thinking about the CO in Tikrit who'd given her the call sign Reaper, not because she harvested lives, but because she pulled the reaped from the field while the fire still burned. She was thinking about the 16-year-old girl in the compound corridor who'd had her sucking chest wound and would graduate college next month. She was thinking about Webb, breathing on his own in a hospital bed, alive because she'd listened to her hands instead of her fear. "I need to sleep," she said, her voice quiet and steady. "Tomorrow we face them." But she didn't sleep. She sat on the back porch watching the darkness where the ocean met the sky, and she touched the challenge coin that Webb would press into her palm at dawn, and she understood that the woman named Sarah Chen, the invisible woman, the small woman, the woman people forgot the second she left the room, was about to stop existing. The person who would walk between 100 soldiers at sunrise would be someone different. Someone who'd been waiting in the dark for 15 years. Someone they called Reaper. The sun would rise. The soldiers would salute. The weight of invisibility would finally lift. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And Sarah Chen had spent 15 years doing extraordinary things in the dark, waiting for the moment when she could finally step into the light and let the world see what the darkness had always known. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.